And I love Viv. She's really great, but she was always a bit older than us and a bit posher and couldn't quite be trusted.
That's a reality for me. I love the people I work with. I love the people that are my family members, and I particularly love Nora.
Johnny Rotten wasn't trying to tear down music when he burst onto the scene. Despite what everyone thought, he was actually there to rescue it. The world saw him as dangerous, but really, he was just telling uncomfortable truths. People claimed he had no skill or ability, but he showed everyone that technical talent wasn't the most important thing. What truly mattered was having something meaningful to say and being brave enough to shout it out loud for everyone to hear. Rotten refused to follow the established rules because those rules existed to silence people like him. Being quiet and obedient was the one thing he absolutely would not do. He was born as John Lydon in working-class London, and he transformed every insult the world threw at him into protective armor. That famous sneer on his face wasn't just for show, it was how he survived in a hostile world. The anger he displayed wasn't manufactured for publicity, it was genuine fuel that powered everything he did. Underneath all that rage lived someone who genuinely loved music and didn't care about chasing trends or being fashionable. He cared about authenticity, about strangeness, about making privileged and comfortable people feel uneasy. Interestingly, Rotten's favorite albums weren't even punk records. Most of them existed before punk music was even invented as a genre. His collection included reggae albums, experimental rock, strange noise music, and art made by outsiders who didn't fit into mainstream culture. These were records that shattered conventions before people even knew conventions could be challenged. These albums didn't teach him proper musical technique or how to play an instrument correctly. Instead, they taught him something more fundamental, about why music mattered, why it was important to raise your voice, and why you should never compromise your vision or bend to pressure from others. The first album that shaped Rotten's musical philosophy was Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica. When Johnny Rotten first heard this album, he laughed with delight while most other listeners fled in confusion. Released in 1969, this record sounded like music was being subjected to torture and somehow enjoying the experience. Captain Beefheart and his magic band created sounds that logically shouldn't work when placed together. The rhythms would fall completely apart and then somehow rebuild themselves into something new. The vocals sounded like someone howling arguments at the moon. Most people absolutely hated this album. Rotten loved it for precisely that reason. The album refused to be likable or accessible. It existed entirely on its own terms, representing total artistic freedom wrapped up in controlled chaos. Beefheart didn't approach melody the way normal musicians did. Songs lurched around like a drunk person stumbling home in the dark. Nothing felt safe or polite about this music. The band played as if they were inventing music from absolute scratch, completely ignoring everything that had come before them in musical history. Rotten heard that aggressive middle finger to convention and recognized kindred spirits. This was punk music before punk had a name or definition. It represented rebellion purely for rebellion's sake. It was beautiful specifically because it was ugly and difficult. What Rotten admired most was the courage this required. Beefheart clearly had real musical talent and could have made normal, commercially successful music if he wanted to. Instead, he deliberately chose weird and difficult. He made an album that demanded real work and concentration from anyone listening to it, and he never apologized for that choice. Rotten carried that lesson directly into his work with the Sex Pistols. Make people uncomfortable, force them to think, make them feel something genuine other than the numbness they're used to feeling. Trout Mask Replica taught Rotten that art didn't need to be pretty or pleasant, it just needed to be honest and truthful. And honesty was usually messy, loud, and completely impossible to ignore. The second album that fascinated Rotten was Tago Mago by the German band Can. Released in 1971, this experimental rock masterpiece accomplished something Rotten had never encountered before. It built grooves and rhythms that seemed to last forever. Some songs stretched to 18 minutes long, but never became boring. The rhythms pounded relentlessly like machinery slowly gaining consciousness and awareness. Can didn't write songs using conventional methods. They would jam and improvise for hours, then carefully carve out the best parts from all that chaos. Rotten heard that creative process and understood it as creation through destruction. You find the gold by digging through massive amounts of noise and experimentation. The album opened with a track that drove forward like a train with no brakes. Another song sprawled across 7 minutes of hypnotic pulse. Then one track stretched to a full 18 minutes of pure trance-inducing music. Most bands feared repetition and tried to avoid it. Can weaponized repetition as a tool. They locked into grooves so deep that listeners fell into them and didn't want to climb back out. Rotten, who would later form the band Public Image Limited, studied this approach carefully. He learned how to make simple musical ideas feel complex and how to make repetition feel revolutionary rather than boring. What really attracted Rotten was the absolute freedom in their sound. Can had no rules constraining them. Their singers sang in completely made-up languages. The drummer played with mechanical precision but somehow made it feel beautiful. The guitars created interesting textures instead of traditional riffs. They sounded like the future having an argument with the past. Rotten wanted that same kind of freedom to make music that didn't fit into neat boxes, music that couldn't be easily categorized or controlled by the music industry. Tagomago showed Rotten that rock and roll didn't have to follow the boring verse-chorus-verse structure everyone expected. Music could drift, explode, hypnotize listeners, and transform into something completely unexpected. Can gave him permission to experiment freely after punk eventually burned itself out. The third album was Peter Hamill's The Silent Corner and the Empty Stage. This record scared Johnny Rotten, but in exactly the right way. Released in 1974, it was raw emotional violence disguised as art rock. Hamill sang like someone coming apart on the seams while documenting his own collapse in real time. His voice cracked, screamed, whispered, and bled emotion. There was no safety net, no pretense or performance, just pure feeling poured directly onto tape. Rotten loved that vulnerability because he understood it was actually the opposite of weakness. It required real courage to be that emotionally exposed in public. What hit Rotten hardest was Hamill's refusal to provide comfort to listeners. Most music tried to make audiences feel better about their lives. Hamill made you feel absolutely everything, the good, the bad, and the unbearable. He didn't sand down the rough edges to make things easier, he sharpened them until they cut. Rotten carried that philosophy into his own work. Don't give audiences what they want, give them what they need to feel, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts. Peter Hamill taught Rotten that raw emotion was punk, that being vulnerable in public was actually the most radical act possible, that real artists bled for their art instead of just talking about bleeding.
The fourth album was Tim Buckley's Star Sailor. Johnny Rotten discovered this 1970 album and it broke his brain open in the best possible way. Tim Buckley had made beautiful folk albums before this one, then he apparently decided that beauty alone wasn't enough. Star Sailor abandoned traditional songs entirely in favor of sonic experiments. Buckley's voice soared into ranges that shouldn't exist for human voices. He screamed, made wordless sounds, and sang completely free of conventional constraints. The music underneath was jazz that had gone completely mad. It was free improvisation that followed no map or plan. Most people called it unlistenable. Rotten called it absolutely necessary. Buckley sang without using actual words on most of the album, just sounds, human sounds pushed to inhuman places. There was one moment of traditional beauty, but even that felt haunted and strange. The title track stretched across 10 minutes of controlled chaos. Buckley's voice became a pure instrument rather than just a delivery system for lyrics. Rotten heard that and understood something important. Sometimes words actually get in the way of what you're trying to express. Sometimes you just need to scream. What amazed Rotten was the enormous risk Buckley took. He had fans who loved his folk music. He burned all of that down to chase something weirder, harder, and far less accessible to mainstream audiences. His career never recovered from this artistic choice, but the art itself survived and influenced future generations. Rotten saw that trade-off and accepted it as necessary. Better to make one completely honest record than create a lifetime of lies and compromises. Better to fail while reaching for something real than to succeed at making garbage. Starsailor taught Rotten that commercial suicide could lead to artistic immortality. The music that mattered most often mattered to the fewest people at first. Tim Buckley showed him that bravery always has consequences, and sometimes those consequences are absolutely worth accepting. The fifth album was the self-titled debut by Neu! From 1972. This record drove Johnny Rotten crazy in the best possible way. Two Germans, Klaus Dinger and Michael Rother, stripped rock music down to its absolute skeleton and then reanimated it into something new. The motoric beat pounded forward eternally. Drums that never stopped, never got complicated, just provided pure forward motion like driving on the Autobahn at midnight. Rotten heard that relentless drive and felt it deep in his bones. This was what punk should sound like: stripped down, unstoppable, and intensely alive. The opening track provided 10 minutes of pure propulsion, the same beat, the same forward movement, building and building tension without ever exploding. Neu! Didn't need conventional dynamics. They needed motion and momentum. Another track slowed everything down to a crawl, proving they could control tempo like a weapon. Fast or slow, both approaches were powerful. Both refused to compromise or give audiences what they expected. Rotten studied that control, that confidence, that stubborn refusal to meet audience expectations. What really impressed Rotten was the simplicity of it all. Neu! Played less but somehow said more. Two people making more noise and impact than bands with 6 members. They proved you didn't need complexity to create power. You needed commitment. You needed a clear vision and the courage to follow it to the very end. Rotten would later use this blueprint with Public Image Limited. He learned that repetition could be rebellion, that minimalism could be maximalism, and that empty space could be aggressive. Neu! Taught Rotten that less was genuinely more, that the beat mattered more than fancy solos, and that driving forward mattered more than looking backward. Neu! Gave punk its heartbeat before punk even knew it had one. The sixth album was King Tubby meets Rockers Uptown. Johnny Rotten found salvation in dub reggae music. This album dropped in 1976, the exact same year the Sex Pistols exploded onto the scene. While punk was screaming in England, Jamaica was busy deconstructing sound itself in fascinating ways. King Tubby took complete songs apart, removed the vocals entirely, drowned everything in echo and reverb effects, and made bass the main character. Augustus Pablo's melodica floated over the top like a ghost haunting the music. Rotten heard this and understood something fundamental. Music didn't need to be complete or fully formed. Sometimes the empty spaces between sounds communicated more than the sounds themselves. Dub represented rebellion through subtraction rather than addition. King Tubby didn't add layers, he removed them. He stripped songs to their absolute essence, then twisted that essence through effects until reality itself seemed to bend. This particular track was 6 minutes of pure atmosphere. Bass frequencies that shook foundations, drums that appeared and disappeared mysteriously, Pablo's melodica crying out over the wreckage. Rotten loved that dub made listeners work harder. You had to listen more closely. You had to find the melody hiding inside the echo. What fundamentally changed Rotten was the freedom this approach represented. Tubby treated the mixing board like a musical instrument in itself. He improvised freely, turned mistakes into features, and created entirely new songs from old bones. This was punk before punk existed as a concept, taking what already existed and destroying it to create something completely new. Rotten carried this directly into Public Image Limited. Their album Metal Box sounded like dub infected with punk rage. Heavy bass, lots of space, echo, and atmosphere. King Tubby taught Rotten that destruction was actually a form of creation. Taking things apart revealed what they really were at their core. Reggae and punk were actually cousins, both fighting the same fight against conformity, but using different weapons. The album Rotten ranked as number 1 was Pawn Hearts by Vandergraaf Generator. He placed it first because it genuinely scared him in profound ways. Released in 1971, this progressive rock nightmare refused to follow any established rules. Vandergraaf Generator made music that was simultaneously ugly, beautiful, chaotic, and precise. Peter Hammill led the band through 23-minute epic compositions that felt like nervous breakdowns set to music. Rotten heard that controlled insanity and recognized his own mind reflected back at him. This was art that demanded absolutely everything from the listener, and Rotten deeply respected that uncompromising demand. One epic track took up an entire album side. 23 minutes of constantly shifting moods, tempos, and realities. Peter Hammill's voice screamed through madness and desperation. Organ swirled like a church building collapsing. Drums attacked from completely unexpected angles. Saxophone added violence where guitars usually lived in rock music. This wasn't just a song, it was a complete experience. A journey through darkness that might not have any exit. Rotten loved that danger, that absolute refusal to make things easy or comfortable for listeners. What made this album sacred to Rotten was its complete commitment to its vision. Vandergraaf Generator didn't care about radio play, about hit singles, about being liked or commercially successful. They made art that was difficult on purpose because they believed easy art wasn't worth making. They demanded that listeners work, think, and feel intensely. If you couldn't keep up with them, they didn't slow down or make concessions. They just kept going deeper into the chaos. Vandergraaf Generator taught Rotten his most important lesson about art. Never compromise your vision, never make it easy just to please others. Art that challenges people is art that survives and matters long term. Vandergraaf Generator gave him permission to be difficult, demanding, and completely himself without apology. Johnny Rotten never apologized for loving weird, challenging music. These albums taught him to break rules fearlessly, embrace chaos as a creative force, and never give audiences what they expected or wanted. His famous sneer was honest and real because these records taught him what honesty meant in art. They showed him that real artistic integrity meant taking risks, refusing to compromise, and staying true to your vision even when everyone thinks you're crazy. These albums prove that the most important music often comes from the margins, from outsiders who refuse to play by established rules. They demonstrated that difficulty and accessibility aren't the same as value, and that sometimes the most valuable art requires the most work from its audience. Rotten absorbed all these lessons and channeled them into music that changed culture forever.